Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am particularly excited to be publishing this video today because this is my first attempt at a long format discussion and a conversation with another thinker, another creator. In this case, it's J. Stephen Roberts, who has the YouTube channel Real Crusades History, which I've been following for a long time and has exposed me to so much accessible information about the Crusades. And so I think this conversation, if that's something that you're interested in, will be really helpful and informative to you as well. And if I can make a note about the Crusades specifically and why I'm passionate about it is because there is this general impression, and I would call it a mood rather than an informed opinion about the Crusades, which is uninformed and inaccurate. Most people have this impression that it was this atrocious expansionist attempt by European Christians to take more land away from seemingly peaceful people, and that's a very inaccurate impression and portrayal of what the Crusades actually were. And so that's why I really like J. Stephen's channel, but also it raises the question, why do we have such an inaccurate impression of the Crusades and other historical events from this time period? And I would say it's because, well, for starters, most of us aren't willing to pick up a history book and actually read it. So what are we left with? Well, we're left with popular depictions of this time period and of the Crusades, and that creates an impression, and most of these come to us through our media, through our TV shows, and through movies. And that's why it would be such a valuable thing if someone could produce a historically accurate version of the Crusades in something like a TV series or a movie. And that's exactly what J. Stephen is working on right now with christianchannel.com. And we talk about that a little bit near the end of the conversation, so make sure you stay tuned to find out more about that. But in the meantime, I would encourage everybody to do what they can to help support this. So what they've done so far is they've produced a trailer and they've started crowdfunding for this, but it really requires those of us who think that this would be an important thing to do to get out there and financially support this initiative. So if you go to christianchannel.com, that's where you can find out more about it and pledge your support for it. It's a lot like The Chosen, which I know is really popular among a lot of people, where they are hoping to produce something of substantial value for history, for information, for entertainment value as well, about in this case, the Crusades. One other thing I'll quickly say is that I want to be producing more content like this. I want to be having more conversations, doing more monologues, doing more commentaries, but I'm also at the limit of how much I can produce without it taking me away from my family or from my day job, which I require for an income. So to facilitate that, you can help me. You can help support this channel by doing a couple things. You could go to my my website, which is www.brianholdsworth.ca, and join the Reinforcements, which is my online community of people that are supporting me in this. Another way is by supporting the sponsors who help support this channel. This week, we're looking at Real Estate for Life, who is a real estate group who will connect you to realtors in your particular area, or maybe the area that you might want to buy in, that share your beliefs and share your values. And we're living in a bit of a crazy time. And so at least where I live, I know that a lot of people are trying to plant their roots deep, trying to figure out how they're going to live moving forward with all the coming potential chaos and the chaos that we are currently living through. So if you're looking to get situated somewhere where you know you can live long term by moving to a new home or a new location, I would encourage you to look at finding a realtor who can really help you through that. Speaking from personal experience, we were actually in the middle of a real estate transaction right when COVID hit, and we had a really difficult time with our realtor after that. And it would have been a major consolation if we had somebody that we knew we could really depend on in a difficult situation like that. So don't get caught in that situation. You can find out more about Real Estate for Life by going to realestateforlife.org. And if you do sign up with them, just make sure you tell them that I sent you, and that will help give a kickback to this channel to help support the work that I'm doing. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this first of what I hope will be many long sit-down conversations with other great thinkers. All right, greetings of the day, everyone. I am here for my first interview, which I'm super excited about. This is the first time I've had the chance to start doing these kinds of conversations, and I'm really honored to have J. Stephen Roberts here for the first one. He's somebody I've been following on YouTube for a while, and I think you'll get a lot out of this conversation, and certainly his channel and the content that he's creating, if you haven't already found him on YouTube. So I'll give you a quick introduction to who J. Stephen is, and then we'll get right into the conversation here. So J. Stephen Roberts is a Catholic and committed student of history. He's passionate about the medieval world and studied history at the University of Dallas. He's the founder of Real Crusades History, a successful YouTube channel and media project with a large and dedicated following. Over the years, Real Crusades History has produced many widely viewed videos on the Crusades and other aspects of medieval history. The channel has gained a reputation for historical accuracy and dedication to the highest scholarship. J. Stephen hosts live streams interviewing some of the top scholars in Crusades history. In 2016, he released his first book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a work of historical fiction set during the Crusades. So J. Stephen, thanks again for being on here with me. It's a real honor to have you.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me. I'm very honored to be talking with you. I'm a longtime fan of your channel, and it's great to finally be here chatting with you and catching up after being on the other side, coming at it from a fan perspective. So,
right. Yeah.
So
well,
thanks.
The feeling is mutual. Yeah. So thanks again for being on here. So you mentioned there in your bio that you are Catholic. So were you raised Catholic? Have you always been Catholic? Were you a convert? Tell me a little bit about that history there.
Yeah, I grew up Catholic. I grew up in a family where Catholicism was a pretty big deal. My dad was a convert. My mom came back to the church kind of around the time that they were first married. So they were had kind of that convert type of fire, I guess you might say. Just really strong Catholic community that I grew up in with a lot of other families. It's still, kind of at the epicenter of my social community to this day, and just been a really, central and wonderful part of my life. So
that's great. Okay. Was there ever a point where you had sort of deviated from the faith and came back, or was it a fairly consistent experience for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have been all over the place in terms of my relationship with the church. I don't know. I think a lot of people go through periods of doubt, or where they even aren't going to mass or leave the church. I remember never really questioning it until maybe I was like a teenager, and I do remember going through a period where I was really questioning it pretty hard. I even went through like a little almost, what's sort of like the new atheist period. There was a period where I bought into the Richard Dawkins and all that stuff. I'm actually a little bit embarrassed to even be saying that in the very early 2000s. But I do think it's if you are the kind of person who questions things and thinks about things deeply, I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing to go through periods where you have different ideas. I think at this point, my perspective on Catholicism is a lot more grounded, and it's, I guess maybe if you go through a test, like a belief system, that if your beliefs go through a test, you can almost have a firmer grounding in the way you look at that later on when you come through that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I would say, and for people that have followed my channel, they might have heard a bit about my conversion experience, but my initial conversion to, let's say, theism was very much a matter of the heart and something that was more experiential than it was intellectual. But then the bridge between that to Catholicism became a much more intellectual exercise. And because I'm a convert, I immediately started to face challenges from within my family and my community of friends and people who were saying that, well, what about this? How can you believe this? Or something like the Crusades, which we'll obviously get into. And And that for me was a moment of inspiration to go find out why I actually do believe what I believe, and to start researching and looking into apologetics and history and theology. And like you say, I think it's been a constant source of strength for me, as the experience of life can challenge our faith and our relationship with God, through the ups and downs and the undulations of it all. That I can constantly fall back on, if nothing else, reason in the things that I have held to be true. And I think that that's a big part of faith that people don't really understand, that as our emotions wane and they give and take, and some days it'll feel like God, nothing could be more true than God and the faith that has been deposited. And then there are days where you're just not really feeling it. But it's in those moments that you have to rely on the conclusions and the premises that lead to those conclusions that you adopted in those moments where you were sober-minded, where you weren't going through some sort of a crisis or a trial or just an emotional mood that might persuade you to look in the other direction. It's in those moments that you fall back on these intellectual ideas and these conclusions that you have adopted when you knew, when you thoroughly examined the premises and the competing narratives, and you said, yes, this one appears to be true, and even though I don't feel like it's true right now, I can fall back on that, knowing that it really is true. I think C.S. Lewis has an analogy about that when he was talking about being in a dentist chair or something like that, that prior to being in that position, you know that before they put the chloroform, I guess they used chloroform back then, but before they put that over your face and before they sedate you and before they start sticking implements into your mouth, you knew that they were going to take care of you, that everything was going to work, that this is all tried and true forms of healthcare and science. But then when you're sitting in that chair and they lean you back and they start to do a countdown or they start to sedate you, you might have a moment of panic, right? Because this mood erupts within you. But it's in those kinds of moments that you can fall back on the things that you knew were true when you weren't in a state of panic. And that's a big part of what faith means that I think a lot of people miss. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Okay, so you've gone through these periods of enthusiastic adherence to your Catholic faith and your upbringing, and then kind of drifting off and exploring other avenues. At what point did you take an interest in the Crusades, and was that motivated by your Catholic faith, or was that something more to do with your education experience or your interest in history?
Yeah, well, it's kind of the two questions kind of go together, because the medieval world kind of was the thing that made me get back into being Catholic. Wow. You know, I went through this period through my teens and into early adulthood where I really kind of I just thought, I don't believe in this. And when I started reading about the medieval world, it did spark something in me. I mean, I was really struck by the beauty, the greatness of this civilization. I have an uncle who he's a French professor, and he had this experience. He was an atheist for many years, and he was in France studying, and he said the first time he walked into I think it was Notre Dame Cathedral, or one of the great cathedrals from the 13th century, that the experience was just so overwhelming. He just kind of stood there and said, these people had something going on that we can't touch today. And I think my connection to the medieval world, it had that sort of an influence on me. It made me think, okay, I have this very skeptical view of God, but I look at this and what these people did, and you know, the beauty of this civilization they produced. So when you it's funny when you encounter the medieval world from our perspective, it's an interesting exchange that happens there, right? Because on the one hand, you know, yeah, these people didn't have the type of science and medicine that we have, the technology, but there's something going on there. There's something about the human soul, the spirit, that seems more authentic and more nourishing to what it is to be, you know, a human being. Yeah. That it really kind of makes you I think it's a very positive thing because it really makes you question a lot of your assumptions, coming from the 20th or 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, and Catholicism, of course, was the sea that our ancestors swam in the Middle Ages, and this was like 1,000 years or so of of Christendom, and so yeah, that really made an impact on me. It got me interested again in Catholicism, and I will say this: that to this day, like you were talking about, kind of how belief can kind of go up and down and this sort of thing. My dedication to the Catholic faith is, even today, it's more rooted in this connection to Christendom, I think. I've never been somebody who can kind of just get really caught up in like these really spiritual feelings, like, oh, I feel all this stuff from God. I mean, I do have that spiritual life. It's maybe not as emotional as kind of like people often think of it in modern Christianity, but it's almost like regardless of my feelings about it, I have this connection to this thing that I value so much. And so I don't know, in some ways it almost makes your faith stronger, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. You mentioned did you say it was your uncle who had traveled to Europe?
Yeah. My family, a lot of my extended family have done some really interesting things, and my uncle Tim is a French professor.
Okay.
And he's, again, somebody who I've talked to a lot about this kind of thing. He loves medieval Christendom too. Obviously, the French language. There's this. Again, that's if you're a French professor, if you're studying French, French Catholicism is going to enter your world. And but yeah, I've actually never been to France myself. I have not been in Notre Dame Cathedral. I know that someday, if I am there, I will feel the same way that he did. But I have been to other parts of Europe, and I have had that experience myself. Like I would actually say I've been to Hagia Sophia in Turkey. What was Constantinople, and I will say this: walking into that church, I had a similar feeling come over me, like, okay, these people had something going on that we just can't really understand as easily anymore. And I also had a similar feeling to that when I was in Israel and I went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built by the Crusaders in the 12th century. Another very overwhelming feeling.
Wow. Have you been following the news out of Turkey about the conversion of the Hagia Sophia into now a mosque again? Because it had been a museum or something like a museum for the longest time, and they were it seemed like they were more interested in depicting the whole history of that building and the civilizations that had existed there, whereas now it's going back to one particular era of its history, being the Islamic era. And I remember seeing the headlines about that it was going back to a mosque, but I haven't followed much since then, because there was a lot of hand-wringing and concern from people that they were going to cover up those great icons and mosaics again that were featured in chapels and domes and things there. But I'm not sure if that actually came to pass. So I was wondering if you've been following that, or if have you heard any more about that?
I've heard a little bit about it. My understanding last time I heard about it was they were going to start doing Islamic religious services in it again, but I would find it hard to imagine that they would go in there and destroy the Byzantine mosaics, which are obvious world treasures that attract a lot of people to that historical site every year. I don't know though. I haven't looked into the latest on that. But yeah, the mosaics in Hagia Sophia, I think most of them are from, I think there's a couple from the 11th century, even farther back, like the 9th century. I think some of the oldest ones may even be like 6th century, something like that. But
I think they do go back to some of the early medieval period. So
but they are incredible. I mean, standing in front of them and thinking about when they were built, and that place is amazing. And yeah, the Byzantine Empire is another favorite thing for me in terms of historical topic, and Byzantine
Okay.
civilization was awesome, no doubt about it.
Right. Right. Well, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but that seems to be, along with a lot of what I hope to get into today, a topic that few people have any familiarity with. I remember one time reading something about just the various empires that have existed. And when most people think of the greatest empire to ever exist, they'll usually think of the Roman Empire, right? And depending on how you view the Byzantine Empire, whether it's a successor of the Roman Empire or not, or whether it's its own distinct thing, the particular, I don't remember if it was an article or what it was that I was reading, but it said that the Byzantine Empire was the greatest empire that ever actually existed, at least in terms of its own longevity. And that's a remarkable thing to consider when you think that, that never came up in my grade school curriculum ever. And I don't think most people have any sort of familiarity with it, if even the name, or ideas like Constantinople as opposed to Istanbul or anything like that. It feels like that era and that people and that culture have for the most part been erased or replaced, depending on how you look at it, with other sort of we could call them successors like the Russian Orthodox Church or something like that, who believes that they are sort of the new Rome in Moscow. But that's a peculiar thing that we know so little about what is considered by some to be the greatest empire that ever existed. But anyways, I don't want to digress too much into that. So before we get into some of the specific questions I have about the Crusades as a topic, I know that you've got some really good summary videos on your channel about the Crusades as a whole. So I was wondering if you could give us maybe your own impromptu 3-minute summary of the Crusades for us, just to get our feet wet as we kind of dive into this topic.
Yeah, well, I think I always define the Crusades as a series of military campaigns launched by the Catholic Church for the purpose of both expanding and defending Christendom in the High Middle Ages. The Crusades take place in a variety of theaters. We often think of the Holy Land. I mean, a lot of people think, okay, these were military campaigns that Western Christians went on to recover the Holy Land, and that is absolutely true. That was one part of the Crusades. Crusading also took place in Spain. It also took place in the Baltic. Really, anywhere that there was any kind of threat or any territory that Latin Christendom was expanding into, anything like that, it was possible for the popes to sanctify those wars as crusades. And a lot of this kind of gets into the worldview that Latin Christians had at the time that, produced this idea that was so potent. And that was, first of all, this idea of Christendom, this idea that, Christian civilization is kind of this collection of Christian, professional kingdoms like France, England, Holy Roman Empire, Sicily, this collection of states that kind of act together as a larger community. And this is under the church, with the Pope as kind of this spiritual figurehead of all of these kingdoms. And the idea is that, and, when the Pope first called for the First Crusade, the idea was, look, these different Christian kingdoms are fighting against each other, and this is disordered. You shouldn't be fighting each other. You should be together acting against the enemies of Christendom, the Turks who hold Jerusalem, the Moors who hold Spain. This is, stop fighting each other and turn outward and start defending and expanding Christendom. And so this was a very potent concept, and it never fully, took control in medieval Europe because there were still wars between the various, Christian factions in medieval Latin Christendom. But the concept did have meaning to the point where people felt that there was a disorder in that. And yes, we are fighting these inter-Christian wars are happening, but it's not really the proper order of things. The proper order would be that all Christians would be united in fighting against the enemies of Christendom, those that threaten the holy places or threaten Christians wherever they live. So that was the thinking. That's how they viewed this. And so that could be applied to a lot of theaters. Like in Spain, the popes, there was this long struggle with the Moors. Well, starting in the 12th century, the popes began granting crusade bulls to the Christian kingdoms of Spain. And, crusaders would come from France and other areas to join in these battles against the Moors there, and also in the Baltic against some of the pagan tribes there, the Teutonic Knights. We know about this. This was a Christian military order that was conquering the pagan Prussian groups and transforming that region into a part of Latin Christendom. So, yeah, I would say that kind of summarizes the Crusades. It's this multi-front struggle and series of campaigns that go on for several hundred years. And arguably, the last Crusade bull that was ever issued was issued at the end of the 17th century during the Great Turkish War. Of course, we all are familiar with the epic battle at Vienna in 1683. And there are some historians who have pointed out that this may have been the last time the popes issued an actual bull of crusade. So that would mean crusading went on from the last decade of the 11th century all the way to the close of the 17th century, which that's a pretty amazing run there.
Yeah. I think most people have this sort of vague sense that the Crusades were one excursion or one war that took place. But obviously it's a lot more nuanced than that, to the degree that we can't really talk about, because a big problem that we have in contemporary society, or postmoderns, whatever you want to call us, is that we don't tend to just look at things as a matter of fact, especially historical things, and especially things that involve the church. We have this tendency to judge them and evaluate them from a moral perspective. And the problem with that is that for a concept and a topic that is so vast, you can't just say, oh, it was absolutely evil all the way through, or that it was absolutely justified all the way through. But with that said, most people don't seem to have the stamina or the interest to actually want to get to know what went on, which is again why I think channels like yours are so important to help people at least get somewhat familiarized if they don't want to pick up a book or pay attention in their history class, assuming that they do cover it, to get those sort of nuanced details. One of the questions that comes up for me when I hear you talking about it is this idea that the popes had to issue papal bulls for a crusade to be initiated. Now, I imagine a lot of people are sitting there thinking, well, in the case of something like the Crusade in Spain, or the Battle of Vienna, which was obviously a defensive battle, why would we need permission from the popes to fight these battles? Why wouldn't the kings of Christendom or the armies of Christendom just fight them, especially if they're in self-defense? What does that say about the ethics of crusading as this idea of holy war, as opposed to just warfare as we've come to know it today?
Yeah, well, a lot of these campaigns that ended up being sanctioned as crusades may have happened anyway, even if they hadn't received that. With everything in history, there's these things can be complex. Like we think about Spain, for example. There were two aspects to the Christian Reconquista. That is this series of wars where the Christian kings of Spain, the King of Castile, the King of Aragon, the King of Leon, were waging these campaigns to retake territory from the Moors that had previously belonged to the old Christian Visigothic kingdom much earlier in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, these were just wars of expansion, because, okay, I'm the King of Castile, and I'm getting more and more powerful, and, these Moorish lands to the south of me, I want to expand into it. I mean, expansion is the name of the game throughout history. Right. It's so on the one hand, the Christian kings had this just natural interest as rulers to want to expand into this territory where they could expand. On top of that, because of the nature of the beliefs of Latin Christians, of which the Spaniards were a part of that broader community, there was this idea of crusading, and this was very powerful and real to these people. So they also viewed it as a spiritual duty. this is our obligation as Christians, is to expand into these territories that are held by the Moors. This used to be Christian land. It needs to be restored to Christendom. Restoration was a big concept in crusading, both in the Holy Land and in Spain. It's like, okay, this was previously Christian ground. It needs to be restored to Christian control. So a lot of times the popes would issue crusade bulls just to support, a campaign. So like, okay, I'm the King of Castile. I want to try to take over Cordoba or something. If the Pope then gives you a crusade bull, he's basically saying anybody who participates in this crusade is taking part in a holy act, and this is going to be spiritually meritorious. So this is going to attract men from France or other parts of Christendom who are going to come down and join in your army, and it'll strengthen your army. It'll also, boost the morale of your own knights. Now they know that they're not only participating in a war of conquest, but they're engaged in a holy enterprise. So crusade bull, if a pope issued a crusade bull, it could either be to start a campaign, or it could be to support a ruler or a group that was trying to do something somewhere. The Pope is saying, yes, I believe in what you're doing here. I want to point out that this is a spiritually meritorious thing, and this crusade bull will do that.
So now, obviously, there's going to be some people listening to this who may have some degree of familiarity or may not have any familiarity with the Crusades, but they have maybe some familiarity with Jesus and his teachings, and they have a tough time. And I'm thinking especially of Protestants who don't share maybe some of the controversial legacy that Catholics do as far as the Crusades are concerned, and who have their own history of condemning the Crusades, would look at this and say, well, no holy war is justified. This was not something that Jesus called for. This is not part of the deposit of faith. So how do we go from the apostolic age and the teachings and ministry of Jesus to almost 1,000 years later, in which his supposed church is going around slaughtering other armies? Is there a way to reconcile that? Is that compatible with the teachings of Jesus, would you say?
Yeah, I think the idea that Christianity is a pacifist religion, I think is hard to defend. I think that's kind of today, that's kind of a recent idea that's out there. The idea is that Jesus somehow condemned any type of coercive authority, or which I think, when we actually look at Jesus' teachings, it's pretty clear that he didn't condemn the state. He talked about, rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, and it's pretty clear that Jesus didn't say that like all state authority is evil. There was clearly the sense that there is a place for state authority. And even Jesus himself engaged in coercive behavior. I mean, we have, of course, Jesus went into the temple and whipped a bunch of money changers. I mean, Jesus himself used violence on occasion, and he even, this is a big topic, obviously, and it's not, and it's we won't be able to summarize it here, but there are scriptures where Jesus talks about, I come not to bring peace but a sword. I mean, there's this sense that, on the one hand, there is a place for, nonviolent resistance, if that's the place you're put in. On the other hand, if you are in a position, if you are a king, if you are a ruler, you have a duty to use that authority in keeping with Christian teaching. And another thing we should look at too is the Old Testament, because as Christians, we don't believe that the Old Testament is canceled out. The Old Testament is a part of Christianity, and everything in there is a part of God's, acting in the world. And this is a place where the concept of holy war really came into focus for medieval Christians. And the Old Testament was a huge source of inspiration for crusading. In fact, a lot of the rhetoric we get, a lot of the ways that medieval Latin Christians described crusading was taken directly from these Old Testament campaigns where the Israelites were going out against, these enemy tribes, these enemy groups who were offending God, who were enemies of God in addition to enemies of the Israelites. And that is kind of how, in fact, that really is how Latin Christians saw themselves. They saw themselves as the new Israelites. They were God's people. And, this idea of the Lord of armies, God does call his people to take up arms at certain times. And you have warrior kings in the Bible, like King David, and, these heroes from the Old Testament who are these warriors. And so for medieval Christians who were so deeply rooted in the Bible, including the Old Testament. We have this idea that in the Middle Ages nobody was engaged with the Bible. That's not true. The Bible was hugely important to them. It was central to the way they looked at everything. And the entire enterprise of the First Crusade was deeply rooted in these concepts of, from the Old Testament. And King David was the model for the Crusader kings of Jerusalem. The kingdom of Jerusalem, they viewed themselves as kind of resurrecting the old crown of David. So
hopefully people are getting more of this familiarity with the Crusades, which lacks a familiarity that I wish it had with most people. You had conversations with people, and they'll often have an opinion or a general mood about the Crusades, which is almost always negative, but they won't tend to know very much about it. And that has also been used to the advantage of those who might want to denigrate Christianity or Christian ideals, or even Christendom as an ancestry to Western civilization. I think during Obama's presidency, he more than a couple times had said that, we can't really judge what's going on in the Middle East because remember the Crusades, and everybody goes, oh, yeah, you're right, we were bad too. So do you think that that's a fair characterization of the Crusades? And on the flip side of that, do you think that it's fair to say that the Crusades were justified for the most part?
Well, I think it's really hard to connect the Crusades with modern conflicts, just because warfare is so different now than it was at this time. And I think, too, the Crusades are so enmeshed in the political context of the period. One big mistake is thinking that the Crusades kind of shocked the Islamic world or something. This idea that, all of a sudden the Crusaders came in and it was just like the Muslims were going, what's going on? Is this,
Right.
The reality is that when the Crusades began in the 11th century, the Islamic world itself had been engaged in holy war for centuries before that. The Holy Land had been a battleground of empires all through the centuries leading up to the Crusades. And in fact, right before the first Crusaders took Jerusalem, there had been a previous battle for Jerusalem between two Muslim groups, the Fatimids of Egypt and the Seljuk Turks. Actually had fought over Jerusalem that previous year, and the Fatimids had taken Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks. And these two groups were fighting each other in the Holy Land for a long time. The Byzantines were fighting various Muslim groups in the Holy Land. The Seljuk Turks themselves were fighting each other. They had civil conflicts going on where different Turkish princes were fighting for control. So when the Crusades began in the Holy Land, in fact, a lot of the Muslim groups that they faced thought that these were just Byzantine mercenaries they were dealing with, and this was just a continuation of the old conflict with the Byzantine emperors. So the Crusades were a very recognizable type of warfare, even when they began. And also, warfare, expansionist warfare, and the competition between various medieval kingdoms, settling their differences on the battlefield. This was just so much the reality. And it even goes, far earlier than the medieval world. I mean, the ancient world, this was the same way that political issues were decided. So I think it's impossible to kind of to point at the Crusades and say, look at this unique and horrible thing that was going on during this period of time, because the reality is the Crusades fit right into the larger context of the warfare that was going on. And again, Islam, which was, the Muslim expansion in the early Middle Ages, before the Crusades, was one of the most spectacular events of the Middle Ages, and it was holy war. I mean, there was this idea of expanding into the non-Muslim world and conquering to kind of create these new Muslim states, and bring that about through this warfare. So that was the history of Islam right there. But in terms of the other part of the question, were the Crusades justified? I think the important thing is to look at what medieval Latin Christians thought about the Crusades, and did they think they were justified? I mean, it's really hard for us to go back in history and make a lot of judgments about the wars of the Middle Ages. I mean, because it almost all looks unjustified, from a modern perspective. But then again, you have to ask yourself, are any of the wars in our period of time justified? I mean, right. People will probably look back and say, no, none of this was justified. It's just violence. I think that, for medieval Latin Christians, they viewed, and there were all kinds of reasons to go on crusade, but in terms of the broader reason, the reason that most people went on crusade, it was for spiritual reasons, and it was also to do something for your fellow Christians. Like, there were Christians in the East who had a difficult time, prior to the First Crusade. There were the expansion of the Seljuk Turks, for example, created a lot of misery and destruction for the Eastern Christians living in Syria and Palestine and these other parts of the East. And when the Crusaders got there, these Christian groups joined with them and helped them. They viewed them as liberators. And this was a big part of the thinking behind the Crusades. And, when you look at the speech from Pope Urban calling the First Crusade, he talks about this idea that there are Christians over here in peril. They're living under, conditions that are oppressive. We need to go and help them. And a big part of the Crusades, a big part of the ideology of crusading was brotherly love, like helping one's fellow Christians. And this cooperation between Eastern and Western Christians was a constant feature of the Crusades. Of course, there's another aspect to that. We know that the Fourth Crusade was a conflict involved conflict between Eastern and Western Christians. But all through the history of the Crusades, you do see Eastern and Western Christians acting together. And certainly a lot of the Eastern Christian groups in Syria and Palestine viewed the Crusaders as a group that was beneficial to them, and they participated in the new states that were created. Indeed, some of the early queens who married the queens and noble women who married some of the early Crusader rulers were of Eastern Christian descent, Armenian, Greek, etc. So I think that for Latin Christians, they definitely viewed what they were doing as this was an act of brotherly love, of helping one's fellow Christians.
Yeah. Whenever I read about the Crusades, or if anybody hears about the Crusades, and even on your channel to some degree, we often think of the Crusades as being an event inspired by Western people. Like this was something that was initiated by the Pope in the West, and that Western crusaders went east and fought these wars. And you very rarely hear about the role of the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Christians, or what we would, in a more contemporary sense, call Eastern Orthodox Christians. And in fact, even on my channel and elsewhere, I've had exchanges with Eastern Orthodox Christians who have a very clear and present memory about the Fourth Crusade. That if nothing else, they can always appeal back to this horrible atrocity that Catholics committed against Eastern Christians as evidence for why Catholicism is wrong, and a general attitude that the Crusades were wrong in the same way that many people will judge it today. And the first time I heard that, I was kind of scratching my head, thinking like, I had no idea that Eastern Christians and Eastern Orthodox today have such a negative view of the Crusades, because in fact the Crusades were called to help the Eastern Church and to help the Eastern Empire. So give us a little bit of context about that, and what what exactly were the Eastern Christians doing during this time? Were they just sort of waving as the Crusaders kind of marched on through and headed east towards the Holy Land, or did they join forces with them? And is it true to say that they were active participants in the Crusade and that they share that history?
Yeah, well, they definitely were participants in the Crusades. From the beginning, there were Eastern Christians who were joining forces with the Crusaders, who were in their armies. In terms of the politics in the East, it gets a little complicated. It's not, a lot of people think, oh, the East, that's the Byzantines. Well, the Byzantine Empire was the most powerful Christian state in the East, but it wasn't the only one, and it wasn't the only actor. And the Byzantines themselves, the Byzantine Empire was a violent entity in its own right. It engaged in conquests. In fact, before the Crusades, we have accounts from Armenian Christians who describe the Byzantines as enemies, as an oppressive force that's trying to conquer them and rule over them. So the Byzantines engaged in their own imperialism, where they conquered other Christian groups and forced themselves, forced their rule on other Christian groups. And the politics of what led to the Fourth Crusade, which that's the famous sacking of Constantinople in 1204, are very complicated. It involved an internal Byzantine political struggle, which actually brought the Crusader army there in the first place. There were two rival factions. One of them basically hired the Crusaders and brought them in to get themselves put on the throne, and that led to the whole thing. So it's a complicated thing. And the Byzantines had their own atrocities against Westerners too. Like there's the famous massacre of the Latins in, I think it was the 1180s, where the Byzantines slaughtered a bunch of Latin residents of the city. So this kind of thing went back and forth. And another issue, and just to kind of like get back to the original question, the Byzantine state was probably one of the least supportive Eastern entities of the Crusades, because I think they always tended to view the Crusades as ultimately something that could potentially be a problem for them. Each time a Crusader army would come through, the Byzantine emperors kind of viewed it as a kind of a threat to their power. So they kind of always tried to both take advantage of the Crusaders, but also not let them be too successful. A very Byzantine approach. Like the Byzantine emperors were constantly trying to play rivals off of each other, and they often viewed the Crusaders as one more faction to just kind of deal with. And this is where there was kind of a disconnect from the Latins and their perspective and the Byzantines. For the Latins, they viewed themselves as, look, crusading is about putting aside the internal squabbles of, Christian princes, getting together and fighting against the enemies of Christendom. And the Byzantines could never really get on board with that fully. And because of that, there was always kind of a frustration for the Latin Christians, because they're always thinking, how come you won't ever really help us? You'll pay lip service to us, you'll give us a few troops, but you won't go with us. And then we also have evidence that you're actually paying off the Turks to attack us at points, and there's all kinds of ambiguity there. And on top of that, a few years before the Fourth Crusade, during the Third Crusade, the Byzantine Emperor actually allied with Saladin. And when the German army came through, Frederick Barbarossa was leading the German contingent of the Third Crusade. He was coming through on his way to the Holy Land, and he'd done these extensive negotiations with the emperor. Like, look, I just want to come through. We're going to Palestine, and the Byzantine Emperor attacked him and just outright attacked him and forced the German Crusaders to fight, just to continue on with their journey. So you can kind of see where this idea that, like, the Byzantines were such victims is, I think, it's very inaccurate and disingenuous for people to present that idea, because that's just not at all the case. But it's interesting because aside from the Byzantines, the various Christian groups, Eastern Christian groups that lived actually in Syria, Palestine, this area where the Crusades were mainly happening, the Armenians, the Syrians, the Maronites, some of these other groups, they tended to be much more supportive of the Crusaders than the Byzantine state. They were joining the armies. They were, a part of the administrations of the various Crusader states. Again, Armenian noblewomen were marrying into the noble families of the Crusader states. And just on top of that, for example, during the First Crusade, almost every time the Crusaders would show up at a city to conquer, the Muslims would kick out the Christian inhabitants because they were worried that they would collaborate. And then those Eastern Christians would join the Crusaders in their camp and help them. One of the ways that the First Crusade conquered Jerusalem was because there were all these Eastern Christians that had been kicked out of Jerusalem and came into the Crusader camp and helped them find supplies and helped them, get organized in the region because they knew the region. So that's just kind of like a broad overview. Hopefully that answers the questions.
Yeah. There's this general perception, I think, among people that the Catholic Church and Christendom in general, at least speaking of the West, has a legacy of being needlessly aggressive and imperialistic and warlike, and has committed many atrocities without much to justify it. And you rarely, again, people like Obama can simply instigate the Crusades within some sort of political narrative and expect the hearers or anybody who might be trying to defend a sort of a Western perspective to then say, oh yes, you're right, and act contrite as a result. And the Fourth Crusades has often been, or the Fourth Crusade and the sacking of Constantinople is something that's often been thrown in my face. But you rarely hear anything about something like the Massacre of the Latins, like you had alluded to there. You rarely hear about the internal politics that played a role. You rarely hear about things that the Byzantine Empire was doing or the ways that they were collaborating with Muslim conquerors who eventually conquered them. And I wonder, why do you think that is, that we have such a selective appreciation of history, and especially this time period?
I'm not sure exactly why. I definitely get what you're saying, though. I mean, that is there. I mean, you will run into people who seem to be shocked when you're not willing to just admit that somehow, Western actors, Western Christendom is uniquely, aggressive. I mean, the reality is that history is just a long story of conquest and aggression and atrocities. Not everybody is committing atrocities, but definitely any civilization has rulers that do horrific things. And I mean, the Byzantines have no shortage of emperors who did horrible things, brutal things. Empire itself is a brutal thing. It just is. So anything that you can, you could say somebody like William the Conqueror, who is a famous Catholic king. He was such a nasty guy. He was a thug. Okay, well, anybody else you would have a hard time finding a Byzantine emperor who was less of a thug than William the Conqueror, or a Muslim ruler. I mean, Muslim rulers were violent, brutal characters themselves. So yeah, I mean, it's just all throughout history. I mean, the story of humanity is a story of conquest, of violence, of military campaigns that involve all kinds of violence. To somehow act like the West is uniquely guilty of these things or has a special guilt where this comes is absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, I'm not sure why that is. I'm really not sure, but it's definitely something that you should not be willing to accept. And I don't think anybody who's talking in good faith will make that claim. And yeah, somebody who refuses to acknowledge this just basic fact of history is not somebody who's dealing with you in good faith. Right.
Okay. Now, obviously, when we think about the Crusades, most people think about just the conflict in the Holy Land. So as a conflict between Christians and Muslims, and it's often, again, portrayed as a a conflict of conquest where Christians were attacking Muslims. But these two sides they both had concepts of holy war, right? So on the crusading side, they had this idea of crusade. On the Islamic side, they had this idea of jihad. Can you describe those and contrast them for us? Help us understand what the difference was between these two concepts.
Well, jihad, probably the most important difference is the fact that the Muslim concept of holy war really comes from the inception. Like the idea of jihad as Muhammad himself was a political ruler and a military commander. So the founder of Islam was a warrior king type figure. He was a man who led military campaigns, who engaged in violence himself, who picked up a sword and conquered territory. So jihad and the concept that there's this religious obligation. I mean, when you look at Islam, I mean, it's really hard to separate religion and politics. I mean, it's a very politically rooted religion, and the way of organizing society politically is laid out very clearly in Islamic teaching. And so it's in some ways it's a very smooth and well-oiled type of machine, you might almost say. It's like a lot of the details about how one is to deal with things like war, with a military campaign, are already laid out in Islamic law from the beginning. Whereas with Christianity, Jesus was not a political leader. The way he talked about these things wasn't as direct, or over time, Christendom kind of had to develop these ideas, and the church fathers kind of debated some of this. And Augustine, is who we often think of when we think of just war, because Augustine, he may have been the first Christian thinker to lay out how just war should work for a Christian ruler, because Christianity had no political power at the beginning, and so it wasn't really until there were Christian kings that this issue really came up, and the question of, okay, well, what should a Christian ruler do? So on the one hand, it's like with jihad, there's this spiritual merit, this religious merit in engaging in a campaign where Islam can triumph and can conquer territory, and then with crusading, there is a similar aspect to that, where it again, it's sanctioned by the church. The Pope says that there's spiritual merit in this particular type of military campaign, and that's a little bit different than just war. So I would say that crusading even evolved beyond just the just war concept, because in the just war concept that Augustine talked about, it was kind of like, okay, well, warfare in itself, it can be a necessity at times, and these are the situations where it is necessary, but there wasn't really this sense yet that it was a spiritual activity. With crusading, once we get into the 11th century, this concept has really developed that, okay, if you, this is like almost comparable to the activities of a monk at prayer, like the same type of spiritual merit. There's this spiritual element to picking up a sword and going out to engage in this righteous warfare, that you're defending Christendom, you're fighting for the lives of Christians, you're fighting to protect Christ's holy places, the Holy Sepulchre. This is it's almost a prayerful act. The Templars, it's like, on the one hand they pray, on the other hand they engage in this spiritually meritorious fighting out in the field. So it's almost like this warrior poet type of aspect to it that's now being brought into the thinking. But at the same time, it really harkens back to the Old Testament and this really early concept of holy war. But yeah, in a lot of ways, I think the two concepts are similar. I feel like I haven't studied jihad nearly as in depth as I have crusading. The early jihads were all expansionist. This was, Islam came out of the Arabian Peninsula, and was suddenly able to expand across this vast stretch of territory. So that, that kind of played into the character of jihad, whereas crusading sprang out more of a concept of like, okay, these territories have been taken, now we need to take them back. So that had an impact on how crusading was viewed. Although there was some crusading that was purely expansionist, like the crusading in the Baltic, right. But the defensive aspect of crusading seems to kind of like play a big role in the rhetoric and the writings that we read from the early period.
Yeah. You mentioned the Knights Templar, and they're a source of interest for a lot of people, and we have all kinds of conspiracy theories about them. There are legends of the Holy Grail and things like that. Who were the Knights Templar actually, and what was trace for us a little bit about their history and what happened to them?
I think the Templars help us understand the mentality of crusading better because, again, getting into this idea that it's a spiritual exercise. It's not just justified warfare. This is actually, you're entering into a prayerful act. The Templars were really like warrior monks. They started out as a group of men who they were noblemen. They were knights after the First Crusade. They gathered in Jerusalem and said, we're going to renounce the world. We're going to renounce our own wealth, our own power, and just dedicate ourselves to protecting pilgrims here in the Holy Land. So they relied on donations. Their weaponry was donated to them, their horses. So they took this vow of poverty and obedience like a Christian monk, but they also were knights. They also were out in the field trying to protect pilgrims, escorting pilgrims, picking up a sword to defend Christian pilgrims against violence. And this mission caught the attention of Bernard of Clairvaux, who was undeniably, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the great Cistercian abbot, who was undeniably, one of the most influential figures of the Middle Ages, probably the most influential figure of his time. And the fact that he took an interest in the Templars, endorsed them, and then helped, spread what they were doing, that says a lot because his influence was huge. And this resonated with him. He thought that this was absolutely important, absolutely a divine mission. I believe he said that Templars, their mission was superior to that of a regular monk because they were taking on, this more perilous, not only did they face spiritual battles, but also, physical battles against physical evil. So over time, the Templars became very wealthy because they were the object of donations across Christendom. Again, showing us how Latin Christians viewed the Crusades. They viewed the Crusades as such a high and holy thing. So a crusading order like the Templars attracted an enormous amount of support from every level of society, from small donations to kings giving them, huge tracts of land and large donations. They were a monastic type of order. They were brothers. They were like monks. They lived, chastity, obedience, poverty, but they lived in community. But they were an army. They garrisoned castles in the Holy Land. They joined the armies, when they were going out against the Muslim armies, and they were some of the most capable warriors of the period because they had very high levels of discipline. And these were all men who came from the knightly class to begin with. So they grew up with this training already. They were already knights, when they became Templars. So, but this spiritual dedication, this dedication to this cause, caused them to give up that, personal wealth, personal power, and give themselves over to a life that would have been a pretty grim life. I mean, living according to the rules of a monastic order, and then going out to fight in these dangerous battles. This is a deep spiritual dedication that would have caused somebody to take this on.
Right. What do you think would have happened if the Crusades had never been called? Like, what would have happened in that time period, and how do you think things would have changed? How do you think things would look today if they had never proceeded with that?
Well, I think it's really hard to imagine the Crusades not happening, just because you have to imagine Latin Christian civilization being so different than it was, because the Crusades came out of a viewpoint and a direction that Latin Christianity was going in. The papacy taking on the role that it took on in the High Middle Ages, the ideology of what the church was and what the Christian community was, and the roles of kings and knights, and it's really hard to imagine the Crusades not happening, because again, they were at the heart of the whole way that medieval Latin Christian viewed itself. So I don't know. I mean, it's I think that I don't know. It's almost like saying, what if Latin Christendom had just been a totally different thing? I guess it's possible to imagine, because I think that the Crusades really represent the church becoming the central governing thing, or the kind of the central organizing force in Christian civilization, and also having an independent role in doing that. Because prior to the 11th century, there was this tendency for the kings themselves and the rulers themselves to maybe take a direct control over the church. The 10th century is kind of famous for being this time of corruption, where the popes were, the office of the papacy could be sold, and this kind of thing. And there was this movement, the Gregorian Reform movement we hear about, where the church kind of said, no, the popes have to be independent. They have, the popes are going to appoint bishops, all this stuff. You've probably heard about this, the investiture controversy. It's possible that, if that hadn't happened and the church had kind of been weak, maybe the church had not been this independent force, and had become more just an arm of the kings, that maybe medieval civilization would have been more about just kings expanding their power and just expanding their territory, and kind of and the church would have been just not as powerful a force, and maybe even Christianity itself might have been more subdued. I don't know, but yeah, I think that for the Crusades to not have happened, it would have just everything would have had to have been so different. We'd be looking at an entirely different history, really.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about a lot on my channel is this need for a common way of life, or a common vision of life, and what we might describe as culture. And the fact that we don't really have a culture, at least in what we could describe as Western civilization today, I see as a bit of a problem, because we still recognize this need for unity. We look at movements like the desire to unify Europe in the post-war period of the 20th century, and where we are now, and other peace movements to try to get people to work together. But if it's just based on this assertion that we ought to live together in harmony and peace, I mean, that's a nice idea, but there are so many reasons why we fight, why we don't get along, why we can't agree on things. Look at the state of politics today as an example, right? Like, we are so polarized by these various factions who deliberately divide us in order to wedge these issues in between the populace, so that they can have their base and garner the votes that they're looking for. It doesn't take much to divide us, and to the degree where it can turn violent, and we're seeing glimpses of that more and more so, it seems, today. Whereas if you go back to the time of the Crusades, it seems to me that they came closer to unifying Europe in a common vision than any sort of mere optimistic assertion today about how we ought to get along would be able to produce. So do you see that as one of the goods that came out of the Crusades, was this fact that it gave us, or it gave Europeans, a real reason to work together, whereas they otherwise would have carried on, especially the nobility, because this was their instinct to fight and to expand, right? Whereas it sort of converted that instinct to something more noble than mere greed or the pursuit of power.
Yeah, Brian, that's a really good point. And this is something I've thought about a lot. when we look at Christianity, there is this incredible power in the medieval Christian world in terms of the way it shapes society. And there's a couple of things that are really interesting about it. Like, first of all, the fact that no human could really claim to, I mean, the church obviously spoke for God, but the authority ultimately was God's, and it was beyond man, right? Mm-hmm. Like this legitimate higher power. And I think one of the interesting things about our world and the modern world, the postmodern world, is when you've got governing classes and powers that don't really recognize any power beyond them. Like, I think one of the advantages that medieval people had was, even if you had a tyrant, and there were, tyrannical, horrible kings and that kind of thing, mm-hmm. they often themselves believed that there was this power beyond them, and they feared it, so there was always that appeal, like, okay, you're a tyrant, you're doing these immoral things, but you're going to have to answer for it, and you yourself actually believe that. Whereas we live in this world today where the powers that be almost view themselves occupying the role that God occupied in the Middle Ages, and that to me is so much more dangerous. I think to get into a little bit of philosophy, I think that's kind of the point Nietzsche, I think, was getting at when he talked about God is dead. It's like suddenly man is going to maybe face real tyranny like we could have never, and that's kind of the thing that we always think about with the most recent part of history is tyranny off its leash. Like, in part technology makes that possible, but it's just like total tyranny, like this kind of Orwellian type of absolute tyranny, a type of tyranny that I think in the Middle Ages it was almost impossible because even tyrants were afraid of God. I mean, we can't be positive about that, but it does, their behavior almost confirms that. So
yeah, I think of guys like Ivan the Terrible, for example, who comes by that moniker honestly, but at the same time, like, you can hear of stories of just these horrible things that he did within his personal life and within his rule, but at the same time, these moments where he would repent and embrace penance and contrition and wear hair shirts and things like that, it shows that there is some sort of a measure or some sort of a consideration that will balance out those more tyrannical instincts that come with power and sort of the trappings of power. You're right. It doesn't seem like we do have that anymore. And Nietzsche he's sort of a good illusion for that, because he really was a prophet of his time, because he was writing in a time where people were just so optimistic about the world. We had these world expos were going on all the time. The Industrial Revolution had happened, and we were experiencing a level of prosperity and cultural maturity and art and literature. Like, we just achieved such great heights in all of these things that what could possibly go wrong at this point? And then you turn the century and go into the 20th century, and it just becomes a complete disaster nearly from the very beginning. Horrors which we never could have imagined. And it's almost as if Nietzsche was the only guy in his time sort of alluding to that and saying that this is the direction we're headed in. But nobody seemed to really take him seriously in that time, and now he's really become a philosopher of our day, for at least his mood and sentiment, if not his thought. One of the things I find really interesting is this general perception we have of the Middle Ages, and especially rulers of the Middle Ages, as being corrupt, greedy, gluttonous, superstitious, and any other sort of vice that we want to attribute to them. While having a more general appreciation for rulers like, say, who we have here in Canada, someone like Justin Trudeau, which a lot of people would look at and say, he's just so nice, he's so kind, he's so civilized. He's sort of the antithesis in the minds of many people to what we think of when we watch movies like Braveheart, and they sort of create this perception of what the Middle Ages were like. But at the same time, there's something to be said about those rulers for the fact that one of the things I really admire about them is if they were going to declare war on somebody, they didn't go sit back in their castles and then conscript the populace and send them on out. They would go out, sword and shield in hand, and fight those wars themselves, which is, again, that's a real counterbalance to the tyrannical instincts that you might expect. If George Bush Jr., for example, had to go fight personally in the wars in the Middle East that he started, he probably would have given that some second thought, right? How did we go from leadership like that to what we have today, and why is it that we so think of ourselves as being so peaceful today, and them so brutal, when in fact they had a lot of these kinds of measures that discouraged them from being warlike?
Well, I think, rulers in the Middle Ages just had so much less power than it's possible for governments to have today.
Yeah.
I mean, the ability to control human beings was just so much more limited back then. In fact, I think that it's to the degree that medieval rulers could not have even conceived of the type of power that exists today. It just would have been unthinkable, But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess technology has a lot to do with how governments have changed. I mean, the way that we can organize society is so much more fine-tuned than it was in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it was really just a matter of, I mean, the local rule was so much more of a reality, just because, I mean, the king was maybe somebody you kind of heard from a couple times a year. There were certain things he wanted done, but it was pretty limited, and you paid a certain amount of taxes, and then a local area kind of governed itself. Yeah. And there were, I mean, it's obviously kind of a huge question. There are freedoms that we have that maybe they didn't have, and then there are freedoms that they had that we maybe don't have. But yeah, it's such different worlds that it's hard to contrast them.
Yeah.
But I think, for me, like, the thing that I admire about, again, like you mentioned, like, a medieval ruler had to put on armor to go out there and be with his guys, otherwise he wasn't going to get any respect. I really admire that. And I also think that we do have some examples of some really virtuous and admirable rulers from the Middle Ages. I mean, with the TV show that we're making, Knights of the Cross, we're zeroing in on Richard the Lionheart, who led the Third Crusade, and I think that he is a very good example of a ruler who you can find a lot to admire in. I mean, he was a guy he was the King of England, so undeniably one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. This would be like the equivalent of the President of the United States. And he would put on armor and be at the front lines with his guys. And, like if one of his men was captured, he would personally get on a horse and lead the rescue mission. And, hack down the enemy until he was able to rescue his guys. So he really a heroic personality, not a perfect personality by any means, and I think that's one of the things that makes him interesting, but definitely a great subject for our TV show. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited about Knights of the Cross, is because we're going to be dealing with Richard the Lionheart. Yeah,
I was going to ask you, who are some of your favorite personalities from the various stories and events of the Crusades? Obviously, he stands out.
Definitely Richard the Lionheart. I also really admire Louis IX of France. He was very unsuccessful in his crusades, but I think he was a genuinely great king. I think he's the model, or one of the model kings from the Middle Ages. His justice was almost impeccable. Godfrey Bouillon is another one that I like a lot. Balin of Ibelin, who was the main character in Kingdom of Heaven, but the real Balin of Ibelin was actually far more interesting, and also one of those figures that really is almost kind of it's hard to find a flaw with him. There are some almost impeccable figures from the Middle Ages. Another one like that is Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the Leper King of Jerusalem, who was an undeniably heroic figure, somebody who endured incredible suffering and yet was tough and strong to the end. Those are some of my favorites.
What are some good books for someone who wants to get a little more immersed in this but doesn't really know where to start? Where would you point them?
The first book I always point people toward is a book called The New Concise History of the Crusades by Tom Madden. It's very short, very beautifully written, and Tom Madden is one of the best scholars of the Crusades across the board, so that's a good one. Another good one to look at is Malcolm Barber's book about the Templars, The New Knighthood, which is just a really good history of the Knights Templar, and I think is a good introduction to the Crusades. And then a really good book about Spain to look at crusading in Spain is Reconquest and Crusade in Medieval Spain by Joseph O'Callaghan. Also a really good sort of broad overview and just a really good introduction to crusading ideology and how it played its role in Spain.
Okay, good, thanks. What about movies? I mean, you mentioned The Kingdom of Heaven. Are there some good movies and shows that you like, or do you typically not like the way that the Crusades or even that time period are portrayed in movies?
Yeah, I have never found any that really appeal to me much. There's one called Arn the Knight Templar that is kind of tolerable to me, but even that is so riddled with inaccuracy that it's hard for a purist like me to get into it. The recent El Cid series on Amazon was absolutely horrible. I could barely watch any of it, even though I did end up getting through the whole thing. But it was atrocious. Kingdom of Heaven is terrible. Even the old there's a 1930s movie they did about the Crusades that's just absolutely a mess. So yeah, that's why one of the reasons we're doing Knights of the Cross, this new project with ChristianChannel.com. Knights of the Cross is going to be finally an historically accurate TV show about the Crusades. So
tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah.
What is this? How did you get started with it? And where are you in the production phase of this?
So yeah, Knights of the Cross is an idea conceived by the owner of ChristianChannel.com, Austin Kelly, and myself. We got together and started talking about this probably about a year ago. ChristianChannel.com is an awesome new thing. It's basically a streaming service dedicated to Christian content. They've got a lot of good stuff on there already. But one of the ideas that the producer or the head of Christian Channel, Austin Kelly, has come up with is he wants to make original content for his streaming service. So about a year ago or so, he got with me and said, hey, listen, I want to do a Crusades historical drama, and I need you to help me do it because you're the Crusades guy on YouTube. And I was like, I've always wanted to do that. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And so Knights of the Cross is that project. And we're modeling it. It's a crowdfunded project. So, we're gathering funds through audience support, and we've already had a lot of support from that. But the idea is based on the model from The Chosen, kind of how they came up with their funding, and it's going to be a season one of roughly 5 to 6 episodes. We've already filmed a trailer for it, which we did that back in March, and that's kind of a little bit of a sneak preview of how the show will operate. Although our budget was very limited in doing that, but it did turn out really well. It's the trailer's really really awesome, and I'm excited about it. But yeah, so the subject's going to be the Third Crusade. So we're going to be Richard the Lionheart's going to be at the forefront of this. So this clash between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, which is a story that's never really been properly told, on screen at all. It's been told poorly, but we're going to do it justice finally. So yeah, christianjournal.com/Knights of the Cross is the place to learn more.
Okay, so now the trailer that's out there, is it a trailer for episodes that have already been shot, or is it more of a fundraising promo so that you can shoot the episodes?
Yeah, the latter. We
Okay.
we basically we assembled an awesome team of people. A group called the Wandering Sword Project is our group of reenactors who helped us
Okay.
realize this trailer, and then we had a great film crew. And yeah, it's the idea is like this is a little bit of a taste of what we can do. It's I would say it's very much the beginnings of that, because we were pretty limited, but I feel like we really pulled something off that's really special.
Okay.
But yeah, that's the idea.
And so are you guys fundraising per show? You mentioned that this is based on sort of the model of The Chosen, which, I mean, I'm familiar with The Chosen, but I don't really know what their production or their financial model is. So maybe explain to us a little bit about how you're realizing this goal.
Yeah, it's basically like, the budget we raise will dictate how many episodes we make. I mean, we may end up only raising enough for one episode, and if that's the case, that's great. That's what we'll do. But we've got if you go to christianchannel.com/Knights of the Cross, if you go to that site, you'll see like the little outline of kind of how the funds go towards each show. And basically it's like, okay, this much is one episode, this much is 2 episodes, this much is 3 episodes. So our goal is 1.5 million to make 5 to 6 episodes.
Okay.
But if we raise like a fraction of that, we'll make 1 episode. So we've got several plans in the back burner, depending on the funds that we do end up with.
Yeah.
And we also have some generous donors who are going to match some of our funds, once we're done, and so kind of like give us that extra kick once our fundraising phase is over. And the fundraising is going to last from now until November. So. Okay.
And so when do you hope to, I guess, so you're going to start shooting after that and then publish it at some point. When do you hope to begin, like, what are the timelines for those things? So for shooting, and then when do you actually hope to air it?
Well, we will do pre-production after we get done with the fundraising. So starting in November, we're going to write the series, and I'm actually writing it. I'm the head writer.
Okay.
So we're writing the series between November and probably roughly like February, something like that. And then we'll be doing pre-production, all that, the first part of next year. Getting locations organized, getting actors organized, getting everything laid out in terms of the project management aspect of it. And then our plan is to film it next summer. So it would be filmed probably June, July, a block in there. And it's going to be filmed in the United States, most likely.
Okay.
And then so it'll probably be released like at the end of next year. So we're looking at like probably a fall release for the actual series on christianchannel.com on their streaming service. So.
Gotcha. Is that the only place people will be able to catch it?
That'll be the first place. It'll eventually probably be on YouTube, but that'll be a while. But yeah, the idea, Christian Channel, Austin really does want to build Christian Channel up as a platform that has its own original content. So that'll be the place to go. So subscribing to Christian Channel will get you full access to the show, next year. But yeah, eventually it'll probably be available elsewhere, but that will be a while.
Is that another way that people can support the production, is just by becoming a subscriber?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, right on. Well, I would want to put an extra plug out for this as well, because there are these moments where, like, say Netflix will produce some sort of a show that reminds people that the people that are behind these big organizations and these production companies do not have they do not have our ethics in mind. They do not have our culture in mind, and in fact, they might hold some of the things that we hold sacred and dear to be just contemptuous. And so you will get people retreating away from that and saying, "Yeah, I'm canceling my Netflix account or whatever." But I don't think it's enough to simply decry the things that we don't like as Christians. If we really want to be engaged with the culture, and if we want to find some way to participate in renewal of the culture, I think we have to be asserting something that is good in its place. It's not enough for us to just protest all the time. And this seems to me to be like one of those opportunities where someone is trying to do something good that we should really get behind, because unless we do, it will be difficult to impossible to realize it. So whether it's your particular show or just christianchannel.com in general, I think that when we see these kinds of initiatives getting initiated, it's an important thing to jump on. The Mass of the Ages documentary was a good example of this recently. So that, I don't know if you heard about that or you caught that, but it was a documentary about the Tridentine liturgy. And it was just some guys that were passionate about this who got together and who promoted it and got the word out, and they were able to get it funded, and they just released it in a very timely way, I think just this past week on YouTube, and it's been a massive success. And that's the kind of thing I love to see when we as a church, and by the church I mean, us who sit in the pews, the faithful, can recognize some need that's out there and rally together around that. So I would encourage everybody who's watching to do what you can to go check out the trailer and the work that Jay is doing. Check out his channel, which is, again, Real Crusades History. You'll get some familiarity with the depth of content that is there and how he wants to bridge that and make that a little more accessible in a dramatized way. So go check him out. I want to say thank you again, Jay. Was there anything else that we missed? Any final words that you have for a departing message?
No, that's perfect. I would just kind of echo what you're saying about, I think that creating art and creating media is so important. I mean, that's sort of the language of our world today.
Right.
And when we were out filming the trailer, I really got the bug for doing this. I mean, it was such an amazing experience, and it was so cool creating, these visuals that I really, just can't wait to do more. So this is what I want to do. So
awesome.
I'm really excited about Knights of the Cross. I think christianchannel.com is a great vehicle for creating content, for creating media. Austin is a passionate and dedicated guy. He's a great Catholic.
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm really excited to have talked with you today, Brian. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So I hope we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, well, thanks again, Jay. And like I said, check out christianchannel.com and go support Jay's efforts to get this new series up and running. Thanks for watching, and thanks again, Jay.
All right, thanks, Brian.
Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.